That's really interesting. According also to this new polling, Scott, when I think something that is very significant, which is in just 4 years, the number of Republicans who say that the country's increasing racial, ethnic, and national diversity is threatening American culture has nearly doubled. It is still at a minority here, but that's a big minority, 38%, and it's nearly doubled. What do you think is going to happen here? Will that continue to shoehorn Republicans into continuing to play footsie with white nationalism, even if maybe they don't want to, but they're going to go that direction?
I totally reject the idea that the Republican Party is based on or playing footsie with or has anything to do with white nationalism. I think that's completely wrong, and you do not have to do anything with it in order to be the Republican nominee. It has no place in our party, has no place on the American political spectrum. I do think there are legitimate concerns being raised by Republicans out there about corporate endeavors and other, sort of cultural push and pull that, some people on the left want, some people on the right want to go against that. So you're going to have that kind of debate, but that's a far cry from saying if I oppose, say, DEI, in corporate America, that I'm somehow in bed with white nationalism. So I don't really accept the premise of that idea. Trump, to go back to what Brownstein said a minute ago, Ron, I think he's exactly right. Trump on the non-college, totally correct. DeSantis on the college educated is correct. And I just would say I have an easier time believing DeSantis can cut into the non-college than I think Trump could cut in to DeSantis's existing college educated base. That's why I've always thought, even in some of the polls that show Trump ahead right now, DeSantis has more room to grow than Trump, because I'm not sure where he's going to find that extra coalition out of college educated voters.
Well, Scott, let me just be clear in what I'm talking about, which would be at some time, I think if you think back to McCain, right, and how he would make sure to speak up and push back on maybe something that a voter would say, or he would be very vociferous. And this is something you used to hear more from Republicans, that if there was another Republican who was saying something that they thought was bigoted and they didn't think should represent the party, they would come out against it. Right? But sometimes you'll see that they don't come out as vociferously as they used to. And I wonder if when you're looking at voters trending in that direction, if that's going to make it more difficult for Republicans to do that.
Well, I will just think back on recent examples of this, since you're saying sometimes, which is a nebulous term. But the most recent example of this is when Donald Trump had Kanye West and that other freak over for lunch, and virtually every major national Republican from every wing of the Republican Party immediately denounced it. And so I think what you'll find if you look into it is that when people stray off in this ridiculous direction, most Republicans actually know the difference between right and wrong on this. I'm not saying Trump does necessarily, because he obviously makes terrible decisions. But I think at least in that most recent example where somebody was trying to include somebody that has sort of a stupid and horrific ideology, it was widely condemned by virtually every corner of the Republican Party.
Brianna,
sorry, Ron, go on.
Can I just jump in? Real quick. Look, it's a continuum. There are very few Republican voters, very few Americans overall who share the precepts of outright white nationalism. But there's no question that the Republican coalition, particularly in the Trump era, is centered on the voters who are most uneasy about the way the country is changing demographically and culturally. You see in polling up to 3/4 of Republican voters say discrimination against whites is now as big a problem as discrimination against minorities. Over 70% say the growing number of immigrants is undermining American culture. 3/5 to 2/3 say society is too soft and feminine and is punishing men just for acting like men. Donald Trump, in his speech in Iowa, noted last night that he got louder applause talking about how classroom teaching of race, gender, and sexual orientation than he did talking about economic issues. That is where the energy in the party is now. That is what DeSantis is trying to appeal to by essentially offering Trumpism without Trump. The question remains, though, is that a national majority? The dividing lines between the parties now is not so much economic as it is how you feel about the way the country is changing. That is the fundamental fault line in our politics, and it is clear the energy in the Republican Party is toward candidates who will express resistance to that in all sorts of ways, from classroom censorship to book bans to what's happening on LGBTQ rights in the red states.
Yeah. Scott and Ron,
but you
thank
can't
you so much,
compare.
Scott.
Let me just say, it is not right to compare a Republican parent who has concerns about what's happening in the classroom with a white nationalist. It's just not correct to say, well, I think schools ought to have this kind of curriculum. That doesn't make you a white nationalist to be concerned about what's being taught in a school. And so I see you're trying to link them together, but it's not true.
Scott, I take your point.
It's not the same thing. But it's on a continuum of concerns about the way the country is changing.
Scott and Ron, thank you so much for the spirited discussion. I do really appreciate it. Certainly one that I think it has to be had. It does. Thank you, gentlemen.